Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to sqadia.com. My name is Mohammad Osama, and today we're talking about the introduction to the nervous system. In the first section of this series of lecture, we're going to talk about the cells of the nervous system. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about the neurons, the neuroglial cells, and as well as the classification of neurons and neuroglial cells. So let's start off with the different types of cells in the nervous system, in which we have the neurons and the neuroglial cells. So neurons are actually the working or the parenchymatic cells, and the neuroglial cells are actually the supporting tissue. So what are neurons? Neurons are actually the nerve cell and its processes. And these cells are excitable cells which are specialized for reception of stimuli as well as the conduction of the nerve impulses from one point to the other. And these impulses are transferred from one point to the other in the form of an action potential, which is generated within the neuron or the nerve cell fiber. Now, the neurons consist of a body, also known as soma, and different type of processes which are also called as neurites. There are two types of neurites in a neuron, which are the dendrites and the axon. Now the difference between the dendrite and axon is comparatively longer as compared to a dendrite, which is shorter, and there's usually one axon in a neuron, but there can be many dendrites in a neuron. Now dendrites take the message towards the cell body in a neuron, whereas the axon takes the message away from the cell body in a neuron. Moreover, in for example, the peripheral nervous system or in the long nerve fiber, we would have also observed that the axon also consists of a myelin sheath covering, which is secreted usually by Schwann cells, and that also gives it a whitish coloration that is the basics of the formation of the white matter in the central nervous system as well, in which this myelin sheath is made by the neuroglial cells, the supporting cells. So at the end of the axon, there are the axon terminals, and these axon terminals then make a junction with the dendrites of other cells or either the muscle. So if it makes a junction with the muscle, then it is called a neuromuscular junction, and if it makes a junction with the dendrites of another neuron, then it is called as a synapse. Now synapse is something which provides the basis of the transmission of impulse from the one neuron to another neuron. For example, if we talk about a specific type of ascending track in the spinal cord, so the message is transferred from first order neuron to the second order neuron via synapse. Similarly, the message is transferred from a motor neuron to the muscle via neuromuscular junction. So here you can also see that the direction of electrical impulse is from the dendroid to the cell body and then away from the cell body via the axon. Now there are numerous ways in which you can classify the neurons. So on basis of number, length, and mode of branching, we can classify neurons into three major types, which are the unipolar, bipolar, and multipolar. So unipolar have one process, bipolar have two different processes, and multipolar neurons have numerous processes. So example of unipolar neurons can be found in the posterior root ganglion, which is the ganglion near the spinal cord, in which the sensory nerves are taking the messages from the periphery or the receptors to the spinal cord. The example of bipolar neurons can be observed in retina, sensory cochlea, and vestibular ganglia. And multipolar neurons, it is a very common example, and they are seen in a lot of structures such as the ascending and descending tracts in the spinal cord, as well as the motor neurons, also called as the alpha motor neurons and the gamma motor neurons, as well as the peripheral nerve. So multipolar neurons are seen in a lot of cases. So here we can see that we have the unipolar neuron, in which there is only the one process, which is then further dividing into two different orientations or directions, but the process is just a single one. So in here you can see that there is the bipolar neuron, and there are two processes. There is an axon here, and there is another axon, and these are the dendrites. So it has two processes, and on the other hand, a multipolar neuron has numerous processes, as you can see here: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, for example, in this example. And the area from which the axon actually originates is actually known as the axon hillock. On the other hand, another type of classification classifies the neurons into two different type of neurons, which is the Golgi type 1 neuron as well as the Golgi type 2 neuron. So Golgi type 1 neurons have long axon that may be 1 meter or even more in length, and the axons of these neurons form the long fiber tracks both in the ascending tracks and the descending tracks of the spinal cord, as well as the nerve fibers of the peripheral nerves. The example of Golgi type 1 neurons include the pyramidal cells of the cerebral cortex, the Purkinje cells of the cerebellar cortex, and the motor cells of the spinal cord, which is, for example, the alpha motor neuron. And there is the Golgi type 2 neurons, which have a very short axon that terminates in the neighborhood of the cell body or is entirely absent as well. So this is also a possibility. They greatly outnumber the Golgi type 1 neurons, and so it means they are much more numerous. The short dendrites that rise from these neurons give them a star-shaped appearance, and these neurons are numerous in the cerebral and cerebellar cortex. So these are majorly found in the cortex around the pyramidal cells and Purkinje cells in the cerebral and cerebellar cortex respectively. And they're often inhibitory in function, inhibiting the pyramidal cells or Purkinje cells, which are actually Golgi type 1 neurons. So here you can see in this example, these three are actually the Golgi type 1 neurons, and this is a lower motor neuron or the alpha motor neuron in the spinal cord. This is a pyramidal cell, which is an upper motor neuron in the cerebral cortex, and this is the Purkinje cell, which is found in the cerebellum in the cerebellar cortex. On the other hand, these are stellate cell and granule cell, which are Golgi type 2 neurons found in the cerebellar and cerebellar cortex. Here we can also see these Golgi type 1 and Golgi type 2 neurons in the brain. So here we have the pyramidal cells, which are usually found in the cerebral cortex. So these long cells with long processes like this one and this one and this one here and another one here. So these are actually Golgi type 1 neurons, specifically the pyramidal cells. And these small cells without any process or with very small processes terminating in the vicinity nearby. So these are the Golgi type 2 neurons. Now, the other type of cells other than the neurons is the neuroglial cells, also called as the supporting cells of the central nervous system. So neurons of the central nervous system are supported by several types of non-excitable cells called neuroglia. So they cannot transmit impulses from one point to the other because they are not excitatory. Similarly, they are smaller than neurons and they outnumber them by 5 to 10 times. So they are much more abundant as compared to the simple neurons or the nerve cells. They are half the total volume of the brain and spinal cord, and they are of numerous types. If we look at the most basic classification, so we have two types of glial cells, which are the macroglial cells and the microglial cells. So macroglial cells are majorly of two different types, which is the oligodendrocytes and astrocytes. Oligodendrocytes form the myelin in the central nervous system, which covers the axons of the neurons, giving them the whitish color appearance, which is also seen in the white matter in the central nervous system. On the other hand, astrocytes, they regulate the ionic environment, reuptake of neurotransmitters, and guidance of the growing axons. And the microglial cells, they are very important in the immune surveillance of the central nervous system. So that was all about the first section of the series of lecture, which was regarding the cells of the nervous system, in which we talked about the neurons, neuroglial cells, and the classifications of neuroglial cells. Thank you very much for watching, and keep on watching all the lectures in this series as well. So thank you for watching sqadia.com.